Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Sarah Iman, ICER's President and CEO, and it's a real pleasure to be speaking to you today about one of our newest offerings, ICER Scientific Advice. For the first few minutes here, I'll take you through what is ISA. And yes, we've already created an acronym for it in ICER style. And a little later on, I'm going to be joined by the CEO of the company with whom we piloted this program, as well as ICER's Chief Medical Officer and Chief Scientific Officer. So stay tuned for that. For those of you who aren't familiar, we are an independent nonprofit conducting value assessments. And the point here is to complement what happens when the FDA is asking questions about safety and efficacy to focus on effectiveness and comparative clinical effectiveness, comparative value. We also know the FDA doesn't really talk about price, but we do. And we do this because healthcare spending is on the rise. We know that increased spending not tied to value crowds out resources for other priorities, and that's harming people in our healthcare system. And we can do better than that. We've been conducting these independent health technology assessments since 2006. We are celebrating our 20th anniversary this year. We were very intentionally structured as both nonprofit and nonpartisan. We consider how we take our funding, think about our sources of funding in a way that makes sure that we maintain our independence. We have no horse in this race, so to speak. Our goal is to get to fair price, fair access, and have enough money for future innovation. And we think that we can do that through a very public, transparent process of analyzing the evidence, looking at the cost effectiveness and the comparative value, and by bringing all of the stakeholders together for that conversation. Doing this out in the open, very publicly, is a core part of how we do our work. We're currently doing about 7 to 10 topics a year. But now, 20 years in, after conducting over 100 of these assessments, we're ready to offer advice to companies. And I'm going to walk you through why we think this is the moment for this type of program, how we are structuring this program. And like I said, then we're going to have a conversation with a company who's already been through one. The why is most simply tied to how we see this fitting our mission. Our mission is to use evidence to drive policy decisions around price and access for new medicines and other interventions in the healthcare system. And guess what? You get a better health technology assessment at the end of the day when you have better evidence. We also know that regulatory uncertainty is a thing right now, in the past, in the future. But generating quality evidence that can demonstrate the value of your product is a long game. Outside of the regulatory whims, what do purchasers, payers, patients, clinicians want to see from a comparative value perspective? The other reason we're doing it is because we've been asked a lot to do this. And for a while, we've been thinking about how to do this. And this is the moment where we have the experience, the capacity, the team that can really deliver some important advice to companies as they're thinking about their clinical development. All right. So what are we thinking about when we're thinking about what we're trying to solve here? What we see in front of us is that the system as it exists right now is focused on the regulatory requirements, the production of evidence to support registration. And that makes a ton of sense. It's the hurdle that every new development program needs to go through in order to be sold in the US market. But we know that the focus only on the clinical trial results needed to satisfy regulators does not produce all of the information that the entire ecosystem wants. And by that, I mean clinical experts and prescribing physicians, patients, purchasers, and payers. Because when you are focused exclusively on safety and efficacy, you're not answering other important questions, like how much better is this drug than what is already on the market, and whether or not the price is fair. And so the solution is to broaden your clinical trial. make sure that important dimensions of value and comparative clinical effectiveness are included in that clinical trial program very early on. That will help the ultimate value assessment once a drug is approved. Because the key to having a good value assessment is having the right kind of evidence. And here's where I'll also mention something that you might not expect to hear on a webinar about this offering from ICER. We also hope that this kind of focus on comparative value, comparative clinical effectiveness, might help companies decide whether or not to even continue development of an asset. If there is very little chance that an asset is going to represent a significant clinical improvement for patients, and the price that you think you need to charge in order to recoup your investment is not going to be met because the drug's just not that good, that is something you can expect to hear from us during this process. So, we have several different buckets that we can focus on, and every engagement is tailored to the needs of the company. But here are a few examples. We can focus on the evidence generation question. How do you think about comparators? How do you think about outcomes? How do you think about surrogate outcomes? We have expertise in the accelerated approval pathway that we can bring to consultation with a company. We can talk about how to get what patients care about incorporated into your clinical trial. One of the frustrating parts of doing our work is sometimes patients are like, hey, there's nothing that we care about in this clinical trial program. And I know there's been intentional and important improvements in this, but we have expertise in patient engagement. And so we could also offer our expertise in bringing patients to the table to talk about what they care about so it can be in the clinical trial program. And of course, we can talk about value. We can talk about the comparative value that an asset may represent to the system, up to and including some modeling of what a price that reflects value would be, or how good would the drug need to be to command a certain price. And again, going back to that decision of, oof, and maybe I'm not going to continue with this asset development and use those resources in something that has a better chance of delivering big clinical gains for patients. And we also have expertise in thinking about how coverage policy may look at the end of the day, whether there'll be utilization management, what kind of utilization management, what the formulary placement could look like in a crowded class. We can bring that expertise. We also have developed expertise in what coverage policy needs to look like in order to be fair. Our fair access criteria reflect the best way to do utilization management to reflect ethical guidelines. And we'll bring that expertise if the engagement is focused on that sort of payer conversation. Through all of this, you can expect our independence to shine through. Those who've known ICER for years know that this is part of our DNA. Given our funding structure, given our where we sit in the ecosystem, we are very comfortable saying the quiet part out loud. And that will continue as we do these engagements for ICER Scientific Advice. A few things here on what to expect. Whether or not you do an ICER Scientific Advice program with ICER does not impact whether or not it will ultimately be subject to an ICER assessment. So if you do one, it doesn't mean you're more or less likely to be chosen. If you don't do one, same thing. And when we get to, if we have looked at your product in scientific advice and then ultimately years later, it goes through a typical ICER assessment, you can expect that our focus on independence will come through as we do that review. You can expect a frank and transparent conversation about what we see in the evidence, what we think the evidence is telling us, and what it would look like in the landscape come approval. All engagements will be completely confidential, and you can expect that we'll sign CDAs, NDAs, whatever is comfortable for you and your company. You can also expect to participate significantly in the engagement. And here's just a a draft of what the engagement could look like. There will be a lot of information sharing in the beginning about what the question is you'd like us to answer, who you might want to have involved in the program, and of course, we would scope the work and sign a contract. There will be up to 5 meetings with the ICER team through this engagement, which we expect lasts 4 to 6 months. Kicking off to understand the questions that you want us to answer, get your advice on who to talk to, give us as much data dump as you would like to. Then we're off to the races doing our own literature review, our own clinical expert calls, maybe some modeling. And then we'll have the ability to meet again and share with you what we've found. As we synthesize our advice, there might be an opportunity for another touch point, but at the end, you can expect another several-hour meeting where we go through the deliverables and make sure that the team feels as though they got the advice that they were hoping for. What we really want to do with this program is help the ecosystem develop better evidence demonstrating comparative value. And that's all on the clinical side as well as on the economic side. We also think that we're bridging a real gap here, that there is sometimes a disconnect between what innovators think the ecosystem needs and what payers and purchasers and patients and clinicians want to see out of a clinical development program. And we expect that companies will act on this advice, whether it's prioritizing one asset or another, whether it's incorporating key measures of comparative value into their clinical trial program. We expect that this will be actionable results, actionable research that will help drive the clinical programs for companies. We were thrilled to be able to do a pilot of this with a small preclinical stage biotech company, Armatus Bio. We focused on an early stage asset advanced for a neurological disorder. And it was a small internal team at ICER that did the entire project. That's another thing I want to emphasize. It might be distinctive for other engagements with consultants who might offer this. This was the same team from beginning to end, and it included every level of the organization. And with that, I am excited to bring those people together to talk a little bit about the experience. And so Rachel Salzman is the Chief Executive Officer of Armatus, and she's going to share her perspectives on going through this pilot. And Dan Ohlendorf, our Chief Scientific Officer and Director of HTA Methods and Engagement, and David Rind, our Chief Medical Officer, were the leads internally on this pilot. And so they're going to share their perspectives as well. And so with that, I invite my colleagues to come back on camera. Great to see you, David, Rachel, and Dan. Thank you guys for joining me today. I think that, one of the things we're trying to do with this program is meet the needs of the CEO who's making really tough decisions about clinical trial development really early on. And so, Rachel, let me start with you. And why did you decide that this was an okay way to spend your time and your team's time when we decided to do this pilot together?
So first of all, Sarah, thank you so much for having us on this webinar. We're really glad that we were able to participate in the process and happy to talk about it today. So thanks. So I think that we've all been taught in drug development. We've heard this information from FDA and from other stakeholders to always work backwards, think about your end product. And the other advice that you always get is engage early and engage often. And I think you had alluded to this in your introductory remarks that our default path is a regulatory path. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. And the FDA actually gives really good advice that I would say goes beyond the regulatory path. So the idea here is, even though we are a preclinical stage company, drug development needs to be on the right trajectory as early as possible, because if you're pivoting in the wrong direction, 1, 2, 3 years later, suddenly you're out not just millions and millions of dollars, but multiple quarters. So my view is, number one, I do not like surprises, and I don't think in drug development we get too many of them already. So the idea here, and I remember you and I talking about this, and I think initially you were like, maybe we needed something later stage. I'm like, no, no, this is exactly the time where we want to engage. We had a clinical candidate that we completely understood our technology. We had an indication that we completely understood the indication from a genetic perspective, et cetera. So it was very important that we were able to advance our drug development in the most directly efficient manner as possible. So I would not have come to you not even one day later. I feel really strongly about getting started early on this process.
That's so great, Rachel. Dan, David, I want to just turn to you as we were getting ready to do our first one. I think we also had like our eyes were wide. We didn't know exactly what to expect. Dan, what excited you most about getting started on our first ISA pilot?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Great to be with everyone. It is really interesting. As we were sort of preparing for this, we did have some conversations with our friends in other HTA settings who offer something similar in terms of scientific advice. Oftentimes, though, those offerings come much later in the game. So those HTA bodies are kind of forced into a corner and are wrapping their advice around measures that may already be set or outcomes that may already be well understood because those assets are further along in development. So I think, as Rachel mentioned, what was really exciting was being able to start on the ground floor, to be able to understand in a very granular way what would make the most sense to measure, what within feasible clinical trial designs could be measured and show some signal for this product, and how to understand value given what we were starting to understand about the condition and the possible benefits of treatment.
Thank you. David, how about you? What made you excited as we got started?
So first, I'm always excited learning new evidence about a disease, about a therapy for a disease. From my point of view, it's always just like fun, and I know you all know this. So you just view me as this evidence nerd, and that's probably correct. But one of the things that I get grumpy about when I look at evidence is thinking, oh, if they had just done this, I'd know so much more. Or if they'd measured this question that this expert raised wouldn't be there anymore. And complaining about that 5 years down the road is just being grumpy. Nothing, no amount of complaining about it is going to change the evidence base at that point. So the notion of being able to get in there early and say, hey, we're hearing this. What if you guys did this to address that concern, and have a chance to talk to the people who are doing the work was really exciting.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yes, we do think you're an evidence nerd, and we love you for it. But I think there's a piece of this that, and I have said this before, and I alluded to it in my opening remarks, it actually bums us out when we look at the data that are coming at the time of approval and there's gaps. Because we want there to be better evidence to show the comparative value, to show the comparative clinical effectiveness. And so like we share in this collective desire for really good evidence. And so I appreciate how you framed that, David. So Rachel, thinking back to the engagement, what did you find most useful? Is there anything you've been able to use from the engagement in your decision making?
I think what we found useful was both big picture and small picture. So big picture was first understanding the lanes under which you were kind of taking in the information and processing it was not identical to the way that we were doing that, naturally. Obviously, that's why we came to you. So I think just in a structural way of how to think about taking a therapeutic forward, that was helpful to us. And in terms of, and then what else we found useful is you are able to access information through, I'm going to say, alternative frameworks and networks, And when people are talking to David and Dan and your colleagues over there, that's just the nature of human interaction. They don't talk to them the same way they will talk to me directly. It's more like nobody's going to tell me my baby is maybe not the cutest baby in the world, whereas they might tell my neighbor not so crazy about. So I was really happy to get access to, I'm going to say, more truth this way, because the truth is what's coming in from external sources. And then in terms of being able to use the outputs, yeah, I think it happens to be that we're dealing with some progressive diseases, which I know many people are. And there's huge challenges there when you're not dealing with an acute, immediate outcome that is going to be a readout. So understanding how not just the field was approaching this, but then how the team at ICER was filtering that information was very valuable to us. And it all goes back to your first question, where David would get, annoyed. If this disease has an impact on mortality, but it takes a really long time to prove it, you need to start thinking about it now. So it made us think about long-term questions. By the way, we're not necessarily going to act on all of them, but thinking about something puts you in a position where you can address it internally to the stakeholders and to the regulators. So I think there was a lot that we learned strategically, and also a lot that we appreciated on a granular level that probably never would have come to us through any other format, not a direct format.
Rachel, I appreciate that. I sometimes experience, I think we collectively, when we've done more reviews and we've seen questions come up more than one time, you do kind of internalize it. You kind of like understand. And so even if it wasn't clear that it made you make a decision between A and B, it's in your DNA now as you're thinking about all of the decisions you need to make every day as a CEO trying to develop a new medicine. So I really appreciate that. So I want to pick up on something you said, Rachel, there. And if there's anything, I'm sure that Armatus has worked with consulting groups as you've been thinking about developing your program. What was different about working with ICER than, say, a typical consulting arrangement?
So I'm really glad you asked that question, because it's really important, because I have worked with many of the larger consulting groups that the audience will be familiar with. I'm going to say there were two really important distinctions or differences that were meaningful to me and to my team. Number one, you actually called it out again in your introductory comments. We got to talk to your functional heads. We got to engage with Dan and David, and we weren't really having to face this massive team of more junior people that were given, I don't know, for lack of a better word, some busy work. You were dealing with our leadership, and we were dealing with your leadership. And that's not the way it normally works. As you know, these are expensive initiatives. And I think a lot of vendors understandably think that they need to hand you a very large team. But we all know the way that large teams work is there's usually a very small number of people who are actually following the plot. So just the flavor of the engagement was very different. And it was, nuclear, high quality people that was very efficient and like peer to peer. And that's just not the way it always works. So I think that was incredibly valuable. And then I think the second part is almost like a byproduct of the first part, is when you really know what you're talking about and you're experienced, you're comfortable presenting content in a very simple manner. Okay. So instead of getting these slides that have, thousands of words on them and all these crazy graphs and all these references, the deliverable that we got at the end was so digestible and so clear at high level bullet points. And I would argue you need to have a lot of confidence to share such important analysis at such a understandable, digestible level. And that was super refreshing. And I'd actually never seen that before. So I really want to, I don't think I ever told you this before. I really want to applaud the simplicity and the directness of the deliverable. No bells and whistles, and nobody is looking for bells and whistles. I don't need that. I don't want that.
Oh, Rachel, thank you. You made us all a smile on the inside and the outside, because that is part of our ethos as an organization. And so I'm glad that came through. Dan, David, anything you want to reflect on that, on how it felt on your side to be able to deliver sort of direct and in simplified terms, how we felt about the evidence as we looked at the engagement?
Yeah,
Dan?
a few thoughts, and thanks, Rachel, for those comments. It's really heartwarming, but I think also equally heartwarming is that we know that we were able to deliver these simple and clear thoughts because of all of the work that a team that David and I were directing did to really try to understand in depth how evidence was playing out, not just in this condition, but in a set of analogous conditions, what sort of measures might be important, how to think about value, given the situation where we did have a slowly progressive disease to deal with. I think what also is clear to me that the fact that we did this kind of as an iterative process with multiple conversations culminating in a final presentation really distinguishes us not only from consultants, but I think again from other HTA bodies as well, because um, we are a private nonprofit organization. We don't have a mandate. So all decision makers could take the results of an assessment and our recommendations to heart, or none of them could. And so it is in our best interest, as well as a partner on something like early scientific advice, to uh, try to make the case for the recommendations that we're delivering, because we know at the end of the day it will ultimately serve the health system in a better way. And that's just a different mindset than if we were, able to say no with authority. We might be thinking differently, and I'm glad we're not.
Dan, I appreciate that also because of just tying that back to why we're doing this. As we see this is so directly tied to our mission of trying to have an ecosystem where evidence on comparative effectiveness and comparative value are driving decisions about price and access. And so it's like it's connected to being able to then offer very clear and sometimes direct advice to an ecosystem in service to that goal. David, anything you wanted to reflect on, sort of what was different?
Yeah, one thing I'd say is from our end, having direct access to the leadership at Armatus, who really knew what was going on, and through them to the people who were studying the product and were the world experts in the condition and who really wanted to talk to us because Armatus was paving the way for that was great. I mean, the speed of transfer and information we could get was so much faster than we often get in a review where someone is vaguely nervous about the fact that ICER is looking at a question.
Yeah. Dave, I'm going to come to you next about that clinical expert engagement, but I do want to let the audience know we're saving some time at the end for questions. So if you want to start using the Q&A function to put some questions in there for Rachel or for Dan or David, please start populating it now. We'll turn to those in just a minute. So, David, I remember this engagement. You did on more than one occasion say you were having fun, but I do recall at one point it was around being able to talk to the clinical experts. What kind of information did you get from those conversations that made you excited to bring that into the scientific advice we were offering Armatus?
Yeah, I mean, I think the experience with every review we do is that when we talk to clinical experts, we learn a ton. It's even for diseases you think you know really well, clinical experts know things about the state of the evidence or what they're worrying about that you don't get from reading the publications, if we're talking even, much later stage situations. Here, we learned one thing we learned quickly was that everybody thought that this product was going to work. So that was interesting. You don't always get that with early stage conditions. Just sort of everybody we talked to was like, yeah, this should work. And that to the extent we were hearing anxieties, it had to do with safety issues and what had and hadn't been proven on safety. And it was interesting. Some of the almost all of the experts were worried in some safety areas, I think because they didn't actually have experience in that piece. But ICER actually had experience in that piece, and we were actually much less worried about that safety area than these experts were. But there were some other areas of safety concerns that we hadn't heard at all until we started talking to the experts. and that had some implications for surrogate outcomes and for whether a certain surrogate outcome that everybody thought they were going to be able to use was adequately going to prove safety in some ways. And I thought that was incredibly helpful in thinking about what studies could be done to prove that that surrogate for safety. People had been viewing it as a surrogate just for efficacy, but it could be used as a surrogate for safety if certain additional study was done. And so I thought that was incredibly helpful.
And David, that leads me to just another sort of question on the clinical piece that came up for me as we were thinking about this. And we had developed an expertise as an organization in understanding the accelerated approval pathway, the role of surrogate outcomes, how to judge whether or not a surrogate outcome is likely to show clinical benefit eventually. What kind of what are you bringing to, and not necessarily for the Armatus engagement, but in future engagements when a company might be deciding between a traditional approval route versus accelerated approval? I want to give the audience a bit of a flavor of how you're thinking about offering advice about those pathways.
Yeah, I mean, I will say trying to predict FDA can be hard. So I wouldn't say that I really trust my ability at this point to know what FDA will think about surrogates. But over the range of surrogate outcomes, you can have surrogates that range from things that everybody believes should work. If you're looking at a treatment for hemophilia that is a gene therapy that raises factor VIII levels in hemophilia A, that's a really good surrogate. Now, you need to really prove safety and you need to prove durability, but nobody's going to worry a lot that if you've normalized the factor VIII levels in the blood, that clotting won't be okay. On the other hand, if you have a measure of neurologic degeneration, say, which there are various ones of at the moment, and you show that you decrease that by 50% with your therapy, and nobody's even totally shown that the neurologic degeneration measure correlates with the progression rate of the disease, we're going to be really worried about that, and any clinician is going to be worried about that. And we've seen both of those things happen enough that we sort of think we can go, look, we need something better than this if you're hoping for anyone to be able to do a value assessment of this or compare this to existing therapies or have any idea how well this is working. And there may be conditions in which people really feel there's just nothing else they can use. And at least we can provide a warning in a situation like that. But I would say that honestly, the surrogate markers run the gamut from totally believable ones to really. And in the really situation, if at all possible, we're going to go, clinical endpoints would be really helpful here. I'm not sure anyone is going to trust these surrogates. And I know you don't want to do a 3-year randomized trial, but I'm not sure you're going to get anywhere unless you do it.
And David, I appreciate it. So what I want to emphasize is that comes from the years of experience we have doing clinical reviews that had surrogate endpoints, right? Because we have seen really good surrogate endpoints in some of our reviews, and we have seen not so good ones. And so just to give the audience a sense that the expertise that David and his team on the clinical side have developed over the 10 years that David's been with us, and then dating back for the 10 years prior in ICER's existence, that's the kind of thing that's hard to quantify that we have that we can bring to looking at a clinical trial program.
Yeah, and this comes up over and over again. I mean, if you think even when you have phase 3 data, you saw what people thought early on.
Yeah.
From the accelerated approval data or the surrogates that led in the early stage trials, and you get a sense for what works and what doesn't work.
Yeah. Rachel, I want to just pull a thread that you mentioned a little earlier, especially around the clinical expert piece and sort of hearing it differently kind of through us as you were hearing it. I want to share a little bit more with the audience about how valuable that was.
Yeah, and it goes to a lot of David's remarks, which I think you should excerpt that minute or two of talking and just put it into its own freestanding, like
Done.
chat or however you do it, because it's really salient. There's one, we all think we know, right? But we can be so deep inside something that what we think we know isn't really what the rest of the world is viewing. So first, I want to make a broader comment. The benefit, what you were just alluding to now, of working with the ICER team is you all are not hired guns in this game. You're following these products. I would argue, even when someone's giving you a FDA approved drug, you're going back to the beginning to really understand, what its features are and what it brings to offer. And you've done this for multiple products over the years. So you're bringing all that context and all of that experience into the room. So for example, as David was saying, some interviews yielded some feedback that even surprised ICER in one way, surprised us another. And we could chat about it like, oh, that's unusual. And you were bringing your experience and we were bringing ours. So as an example, to actually answer your question, we are, this is in the public domain, we are using vectorized RNAi, so that is our underlying technology. However, we are pointing that technology at various neuromuscular indications. The point here is what we kind of began to much better appreciate only as a result of this engagement with ICER is that the clinical experts were somewhat siloed from the technology experts. And that actually matters because if you can't marry the indication with the technology, you can't really do an accurate assessment of risk and benefit. So, what became very clear to us is these silos, for lack of a better word, were probably thicker and higher and more existent than we had assumed. And it kind of called out more work for us to do on an educational level. I was not expecting the silos to be as much as they were, but after the fact, we began to appreciate a little bit more. And then the other point that I wanted to make is sometimes there is a disconnect of communication across all of the stakeholders when you're talking about taking a product from point A to point B in terms of what endpoints matter, in terms of how to measure those, and very much around accelerated approval and how much one technology might anchor to something that we believe to be true, which could be based on science and it could just be based on experience. So I think to sum it all up, it helped us better appreciate that we were not all sitting together in one room having the same conversation.
Rachel, would it be fair to summarize that as saying that in addition to the concrete advice our teams were able to give about clinical trial development, the comparative value questions you need to answer, you also identified opportunities to focus your communication strategy and your stakeholder engagement strategy to sort of align some of the different members of the ecosystem on whether understanding the technology or what you're trying to achieve?
100%, and that actually what is 100% actionable all the time. It
Yeah,
helped us refine, we have limited resources like
right.
everyone. It helped us refine where our educational efforts were going. And then the nice part is everyone wants to learn. We didn't get any feedback that people were like, we're worried about the safety, but we don't want to understand more about the technology. But it helped us understand which elements of the technology, again, not obvious at all, because when you're up to date in your indication in your science, sometimes you're a little bit behind on the technology for understandable reasons. So I agree that was very actionable, immediately actionable for us, even on one-on-one conversations.
Fantastic. Thank you, Rachel. Dan, I want to turn to you on the comparative value piece. I mean, we think companies should know what kind of information they need to gather and collect early on so that they can demonstrate that value at approval. One of the things our approach does is analyze the literature, look at the cost effectiveness and comparable diseases to advise on what kind of data a company might have. Can you just tell us a little bit more about that process and how it worked with the Armatus engagement?
Sure. So with input from Armatus and some of the clinical experts, we looked at the literature in a targeted way in about half a dozen analogous conditions. These were also neuromuscular and slowly progressive, so they shared some similarities with the trajectory. One of the things that kind of ties back to the comments that both David and Rachel just made, that it was an interesting feature of what we did was we not only looked at published cost effectiveness analyses, we also looked at key clinical trials and observational studies to try to understand outcome measurement in detail. But importantly, and kind of as a corollary to David's comments, we looked for editorials and commentaries as well as clinical guidelines to understand what issues or concerns there were with some of those key measures. So any responsible value assessment has to start with an informed clinical understanding. But then the trick is to try to take all of that understanding and create a model that is digestible for decision makers, to try to understand cost effectiveness and budget impact for that matter in a way that decision makers can appreciate. So we looked at the cost effectiveness literature. We pulled information out from those studies and tried to understand the commonalities across those study designs. So one key aspect in this instance is that there was an attempt made to define what a responder to treatment looked like.
Right.
So kind of take either composite endpoints or combinations of endpoints from those clinical studies and turn that into an understanding of what treatment success looked like, which is very important to payers, of course. It's also important to try to understand what limitations existed in these models and how those were stated. And in a situation where there may be an asset that is considering an accelerated approval pathway before confirmation of benefit later, to try to understand how the obvious uncertainty that would filter through in the model would be treated. Because if you're in an era or you're in a situation, as David alluded to, where you're mostly focused on biological plausibility as opposed to a defined, validated surrogacy relationship, and that biological plausibility could exist on a spectrum from believable to maybe less so, you really want to try to test that out in your models. And so we look to see how that uncertainty was dealt with. And so that's really what the process was around. We focused on both the potential design of a cost effectiveness model, as well as advice for Armatus on what kind of complementary data they might collect outside of the modeling effort and outside of the clinical study program, because you can't measure everything that's important in a clinical trial, but you do want to bring to the table some important features of this product that would benefit health, that would benefit well-being and function, and you could measure that outside of the clinical trial and feasibly link it in some ways. So those are really the elements that we focused on, and it was a really interesting process.
Yeah. Rachel, anything you want to reflect on that comparative value piece that Dan and his team did?
I just want to add on to Dan's last remarks that there's some data you might want to collect. A lot of it is a very light lift if you start early.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of information surrounding the patient and caregiver and society's experience with a particular indication that is maybe easily addressed by adding one or two questions to an ongoing independent registry that we are not even sponsoring. So it's truly independent and maybe being publicly funded. So I just want to point out that a lot of the information that helps strengthen the comparative effectiveness study and deep dive into it, it's not a heavy lift as long as you start early and are aligned with the other parties. So to me, that's a really important takeaway.
I really appreciate that, and I'm glad to hear it too, right? So we know how resource intensive clinical programs are, and that the environment right now for funding is complicated to say the very least. And so the fact that there might be these things that are an easy lift, not a big outlay of resources, but have big dividends later for being able to show the patient-centeredness, to show the comparative value is really important. Keep the
And then
questions coming. I'm sorry. Go, Rachel, go,
I just
please.
want to add one more plug, and this is where your branding is helpful. So let's just say we're engaging with an independent registry, and patients are coming in once or twice a year, and they're spending 15 minutes answering a questionnaire, doing a test, and we want to add 3 minutes. Well, we say like, well, we had a discussion with ICER, and they saw that there could be value in understanding this one element of the disease experience. That goes a long way in convincing the patients, their representatives, whoever's leading the registry, like these extra 3 minutes are actually probably a really good idea. So that light lift can even be made lighter by name dropping.
Wow. Thank you, Rachel. Continue to name drop.
Yes.
It gives me, and I was going to say the questions are coming in. We're going to turn to those in just a minute. Keep them coming. It gives me a moment to also just offer, one thing that we're very proud of at ICER is how we've developed our patient engagement program over the years. People have heard me say, I am not afraid to say that we weren't very good at it when we started, and now we're really good at it because we've learned a lot by listening to patients, by developing our program where the patient perspectives are core to how we do our work. I want to just offer up that's expertise that we can bring to an engagement in the ICER scientific advice realm as well. And that when patient engagement happens early in a clinical program, you have the opportunity to incorporate some of the outcomes that matter most to patients and their families. And that's going to increase your ability to demonstrate comparative value if your drug works come time of registration. And to Rachel's point, some of it might not be that heavy a lift. I know that we've had these conversations internally when we're doing a typical review, and we're like, gosh, if they had just included one measure of quality of life in this program, that we were able to crosswalk to the standard measures that we use to, measure quality of life, we'd have a lot better chance right now of being able to incorporate that, and we can't because it's not there. And so there's those opportunities early on for a decision to incorporate something that helps increase the patient-centeredness of the data that are produced that we would bring to an ISA engagement. So I just wanted to give that plug. All right, let's go to some of these questions because they're coming in sort of fast and furious. Really excited to see this. Rachel, there's a question that came in for you that said, reflecting on the process, are there features that you consider critical or anything that you would change about how the ISA engagement went?
Yeah, it's a really important question. So, what was critical is that we were having the same conversation with each other and that we understood each other. What are we really talking about here? And that we had the same resources to begin with. We had talked about the importance because everything you're doing is comparative. Nothing is starting out of nowhere. And I think to me that was a little bit challenging because it's a little bit chicken and egg. So I remember thinking like they want all this comparability in other diseases, but like our indications are unique, like every indication is unique. I can give you this, that seems similar, but nothing is exactly identical. So I would make sure that I had really, I'm going to say deep conversations with the people on this call exactly right now, explaining to you why we pick these as our preferred analogous conditions and share with you more of our concerns about what's different. Okay, like this disease is progressive and it's neuromuscular, but it happens, only in males. And I would want to get that feedback. So I think I would have spent a little bit more time on that. And then the other point is we could talk to you about that ICER evidence matrix all day long. So I just want to throw that back in your lap because to me that's something that in terms of being prepared, I would have wanted to have a conversation about that before we started anything.
Yeah, that's a really great point. No, Rachel, thank you.
Yeah,
Yes, our evidence, our EBM matrix, talking about the certainty we have in the benefit that we're seeing, and then the magnitude of the benefit that we're seeing. Okay, we might incorporate that into our engagements. Everyone gets an EBM matrix tutorial.
it's
It's not a bad
challenging.
thing.
Yes.
All right, thank you, Rachel. Another question came in about timing. And I think this is really important because The question is, at what stage of development, phase one, two, earlier, would you recommend engagement to happen? And then another question about how long our engagement in the process is. But Rachel, we talked to you preclinical, so I'm going to have you kind of talk about why you thought that timing was right for you. And then Dan and David, I'll go to you about what you think the ideal phase is, because I think the answer is there isn't one. But let's hear a little bit from Rachel about where we kind of did we hit the mark by engaging preclinical with you?
Yeah, as I said earlier, I think we were exactly wanted at the timing we wanted to be. And by preclinical, we have a clinical candidate that has already, advanced to pre-IND. So we're able to take advantage of the feedback from the regulator on that. So we understood our product and it was the candidate was, finalized. So I think that's important because I think if someone comes to you before they've selected their clinical candidate, I think that's just going to be a lot of extra work. So that would
Mhm.
be something that maybe is too early. And then we understood our indication. And I think that, and we understood the pathology, with genetic disease. So I think preclinical, once you have a clinical candidate and you understand who you're trying to treat and a good sense of what you're trying to accomplish in that population, you need to have, I guess, to sum it all up, you should have a target product profile before you come to do this engagement. It can be a high level target product profile, but you really need to have one.
That's helpful. David, as you think about timing, especially sort of the clinical piece, is there an ideal time for scientific advice?
Um, I really do think that pretty much any time you're imagining doing a study involving humans, um, there's something useful that we could provide at any of the stages. I think before you're imagining a study doing humans, we're probably not that good. And I think after you've done all your studies involving humans, we're at the point of reviewing what you've done. We're probably not that helpful. So I would say over that full spectrum, anytime we could affect what study design looks like, what data are, the whole PICOT outline, um, because we care about every one of those pieces of the PICOT up until the time we're doing a review. And that's true not just for us, but for anyone trying to do comparative effectiveness work, whether it's an HTA body in another country or somebody writing an editorial in the US or anything like
Thank you. Dan, what would you add about timing?
Just a translation in case anyone's not familiar with what PICOT means, population intervention comparator outcome timing. So this is how we scope our assessment. I think it is true that there is really something we can offer at any stage. And we also know pragmatically that in many um, innovator settings, there really isn't enough money to invest in something like this until maybe around phase two or so. So it may be that's not feasible for some companies to even think about this until that point. But I think there is information that we can offer. It may be less around clinical trial design and more around some of the specifics and nuances of measurement and also the complementary data collection as you get later on in development. But I think it's feasible to think about it at any stage. It's also feasible to think about different potential partners. So we are talking to investors who are thinking about either advising companies on in-licensing an asset or acquiring companies that have a single product. And so it really does run the gamut. And I think obviously, I think no company would, if they're already kind of into phase three, they're not going to look for something like this because it's a little bit too late. But I think anything before that is fair game.
The one thing I would add to that is just like the big buckets of what we want to offer through scientific advice, the sort of evidence generation, the patient-centeredness, the value calculation. Earlier is better. Rachel made the point earlier that sometimes if it is early enough, it can be actually kind of a light lift because it's easier at that point. I will say that we have expertise in payer coverage policy and how payers think that type of advice can probably happen a little bit later in the clinical trial program. You might not like the answer because you've missed an opportunity to gather some information earlier on, potentially, that could influence sort of payer decision making. But if you want our expertise in how utilization management, how fair access, how formulary placement might happen, that could probably happen a little bit later. And there was a question on that one about sort of how long is an engagement, or I've seen that in the Q&A. We've scoped this to be about a 4 to 6 month engagement with the company. We've made it so that we want to keep it within a pretty tight sprint in order to produce information that is timely and relevant in the way we scope our capacity. But it is dependent on the engagement, and we're happy to work with companies who have either faster or longer timelines depending on some milestones. All right, we probably have time for 2 or 3 more questions before we wrap up because we're getting close to the hour. Here's a great one. What do companies need to do to prepare for ICER to begin this process? Is a briefing book similar to what NICE and Canada's Drug Agency do required? So they've noted, this listener, A plus for listening comprehension. We do our own literature review as we do. That is correct. So Dan, let me turn to you because this is as you do our international work. Just expound a little bit on the difference between our approach and that NICE and CDA take, especially on that briefing book question.
Yeah, and I think the difference really is, again, going back to that issue of a mandate. So the early advice offered by other HTA bodies that do have um, either some mandatory authority or at least kind of a national voice in helping make determinations around coverage, pricing, and reimbursement. They are essentially asking companies to make their best argument for the product clinically and from a value perspective, and then they are commenting on that. They may do some literature searching themselves as part of a method to inform that response, but it's a reactive situation, and it makes sense in a setting like that. In our setting, it's very different, and I think it's because of the way we work. It is very interactive. It's very uh, iterative, and it really follows how we handle our assessments themselves. We are interacting with stakeholders on a regular basis multiple times, and that's the way we want to do this as well. So we don't need a formal briefing book, but we do need some information from the company about, as Rachel said, the target product profile, some knowledge around the indication, other guidance from the company. But then it's a series of conversations that we'll manage with information that we're gathering, people that we're talking to, and then repeated interactions with the company.
Thank you, Dan. I'm going to run through a few of these rapid fire just to make sure that a couple of these are kind of process related and I don't want to miss the opportunity. Assuming a company wants to proceed, what's the lead time? Just a couple of months and sometimes faster. We are a small organization. We are kind of built to do one at a time, but we are hoping to be able to engage with companies quickly. So if there's interest and you have a particular timeline, when you reach out to us, just let us know that. So now I can plug the email address that you can all have, which is isa@icer.org, is where you can send any information for further conversation. We're happy to jump on a call and hear about your program and see if it's a good fit. There's a great question in here about, are patients, payers, and providers included in the process, and does this chance to engage with them? Great question. It is imagined that yes, they would be involved, and it's dependent on the scope of the engagement that the company wants. And so in this case with Armatus, we absolutely talked to providers and clinical experts. That was a critical part of doing the work. We did not talk to payers at this point, and I think that had a lot to do with the timing and where we were and what Rachel and her team needed. If a particular company wanted us to engage with payers and patients, we could scope it that way, and we have expertise in doing that. There's another question in here about how does that engagement happen? Is it ad boards, focus groups, one-on-one? There again, it depends. It would be in concert with the sponsor to see what would elicit the best information. We have experience doing all of those in our own patient engagement work and in the reviews that we do. We've done focus groups, we've done one-on-one. And so I think that it would depend on what kind of question you're trying to answer. Um, so we have 30 seconds, and I'm going to give everybody here for like their one sentence with one semicolon, just like reflections on this program and what we're hoping to offer. Rachel, you get the last word. So, David, I'm going to start with you.
Boy, this is so stressful. The Steve question, but
This,
to me, um, I think that ICER has a lot to offer at this stage, so that for us and for everyone else, the evidence that comes out of a program is better, and for patients, they get the answers they need.
Thank you. Dan.
I'm really excited about this, and I think I completely agree with David's sentiments, but I also feel as though, in all honesty, we have a stake in this game too. We want to see better evidence at the end of the day,
Yeah,
and this is one way to accomplish it.
thank you. Rachel.
I think this is a mechanism where, like so many other initiatives in drug development, the more you put in and the more transparent you are, the more you get out. So I think coming into it with a very open mind and appreciating what is going to come back is essential to getting the most out of the product.
Very well said. I'll just close with my deep appreciation to Rachel for spending time with us, for being brave enough to do this pilot with us last year. Thank you. And to Dan and David for offering their insights. For more information, please contact us at ISA at ICER.org. We're really thrilled to be able to bring this advice and this experience to the drug development program, and we look forward to hearing from everyone. I hope everyone has a really great day. Thank you.
Thanks.